Sir, good afternoon. Can you see and hear me?
I can, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mrs. Chambers. Before we turn to look at, in fact, just one of the bugs, may we just return to a question I asked you before lunch? Do you remember your afterthoughts document?
Yes.
I asked you whether you had shared that with Mr. Jenkins.
Yes.
And you said, unless the email trail showed that you had, you couldn't recall having done so. I think that's a summary of your evidence. And we looked at the email distribution in the email I showed you right before lunch. Never mind showing him the document or sending him the document. Do you recall, after writing it, discussing any of the four issues with him?
I certainly don't remember any formal discussion. Whether we had an informal chat, I've no recollection of that. I can't say yes or no on that.
Just breaking it down, a conversation or conversations with him about the need to conduct a sort of fundamental review of data before a legal case was commenced.
So we may, I mean, I think he might have been of the same view of that anyway. Whether we actually had a discussion along those lines as to how necessary it was, I can't be certain. I do know that subsequently, when he was preparing for other court cases, he did do, he appeared to be doing a fairly thorough examination, because occasionally he'd ask me to double check some of the things he was looking at as well. But I'm not sure, I don't think this was ever formally documented anywhere.
Was that, when he was doing this, what appeared to be a thorough examination, at the stage at which he was preparing to be a witness giving evidence, or was it the issue that you were concerned with, which is conducting a fundamental review of data before proceedings are even commenced?
I don't think he would have been involved until proceedings were commenced.
What about the other issue that you raised in the paper concerning giving evidence of fact or opinion evidence as a witness?
I don't think I ever discussed that with him.
Did you ever discuss with him the question of creating a list of available data for provision to the security team, so they would know what was there in order that disclosure obligations might be complied with?
I've no recollection of discussing that with him, and I don't think he'd have been in a position to have made that list anyway.
Who was responsible for taking forward the four issues that you had raised in your paper?
I don't know. I was concerned that nobody seemed to be doing any sort of a follow-up, so I sent it to my manager. So at that level, I was really passing it on to him, and as we've seen, he then passed it up to both his manager and the security team manager.
Thank you. Can we turn to bugs, errors and defects? In the light of the approach that the inquiry, the chairman is taking to Mr. Justice Fraser's judgments and the significant quantity of material that we've now got in relation to bugs, errors and defects, and the helpful explanations you've given in your first witness statement in relation to some of them, I'm just going to concentrate, if I may, on the suspense account bug.
Right, which number is?
It's 3, bug 3.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Would you agree with the following summary of the suspense account bug? Firstly, it's a Horizon Online bug.
Yes.
Secondly, it involved branches that deleted a stock unit at the end of 2010 with a transaction in local suspense, and they were affected as a result of that change.
Yes.
Thirdly, in essence, the transaction that was in the local suspense of the deleted stock unit was left in the database used to construct branch trading statements in the same trading period in the following years.
Yes.
Fourthly, this would cause a false discrepancy. It caused discrepancies in 2012, but they weren't identified as a bug at that stage.
Yes.
The bug was only discovered, lastly, in February 2013.
Yes.
Okay. Can we look then and pick the story up with one of the initiating peaks of February 2013? Fujitsu 308 1875. Can you see this is a peak numbered PC 0223870?
Yes.
The summary is branch and then a FAD code is given, has an unexplained discrepancy.
Yes.
And if we just scroll down, please, we can see that it's opened on the 25th of February 2013.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Earlier on, you referred to a bug that had been slow to recognise, that had affected 14 branches.
Yes.
Is this the bug you're
This
referring
is the
to?
bug I was referring to, yes.
And I think you said at the time that that was in part because of a failure at the MBSC and help desk area to escalate to the SSE earlier.
Yes, I can't remember now whether this... I don't think this actually got as far as the Horizon help desk. I'm sorry, I can't remember now. I think there were calls at NBSC. It was discovered subsequently when checks were made. And I can't remember if none of them were passed on to the Horizon help desk or just one, but nothing got as far as SSC until 2013.
And so essentially there's a bug in the system causing discrepancies
Yeah.
that has been reported by a postmaster but has not been escalated to the SSC.
Yes.
And therefore the bug continues to work the discrepancies.
Yes.
So the summary of the call, the branch has, I think that is, an unexplained discrepancy. Yes, and then if we scroll down, please. Further notes, the branch has an unexplained discrepancy. They balanced and rolled trading period on the 6th of February. They have one stock unit AA, and this was balanced with a loss of £39.57, which was transferred to local suspense. However, the figure that was cleared out from local suspense was much higher, £9,839.45.
Yes.
I've carried out transaction logs for all transactions for date range 31st of Jan to the 6th of Feb. Branch has submitted copies of the final balance reports from trading period 10, BP4. What does that mean?
Yes. By this time, instead of having weekly cash account periods, we had 4-week trading periods, and they could be split into weekly balance periods if postmasters wanted to balance things weekly.
So this is the balancing period 4 of the
Yeah.
trading period 10
Yeah.
and balance period 5 of
5.
trading period
Yeah.
10. Yes?
Yes.
The balance report for TP10BP5 shows discrepancy transferred of £39.57 and then discrepancy resolved of £9,839.45. Transaction log completed for all transactions does not show any other figures being entered into or removed from the housekeeping local suspense account.
Yes.
So this text here, is this taken from the MBSC? Is this an MBSC person writing it?
Yes, it appears so. The contact was Ibrahim at NBSC, and he'd probably sent this to HSH, whatever they were called then, quite possibly as an email or something.
And so it's been cut into the peak.
it's been put into a new power help call or whatever calls were called at that point, which has then been routed to peak and has created a peak in the process.
Got it. And then if we scroll down, please. There is some process chat, yes?
Yeah.
You changed the summary
Yeah.
from branch has an unexplained discrepancy for putting the branch code having an unexplained discrepancy.
That was standard practice. We always tried to put the branch code in the heading of the call.
Is that for subsequent searching purposes?
It would have been picked up for searching wherever it was, but just so it just made it clearer. And then if you were looking at the stack, you might possibly see if you've got several.
And so the call having been assigned to you at 5:02, 45 minutes later you make the change, and then the following day you make your first substantive entry, is that right?
Yes.
If we just scroll down so we can read the whole of that. When they completed the balance on the 6th of February and cleared the loss from local suspense, the amount cleared was £9,000 odd instead of the loss they put into local suspense, which was £39 odd. This appears to be a consequence of something that happened during the previous trading period rollover on the 2nd of Jan. A, quote, gain to local suspense of £9,000 odd was included in the DEF opening figures. What are the DEF opening figures?
DEF was a default stock unit. I can't now fully remember its purpose, but every branch by this point had one of those.
I don't think any of the local suspense products should ever appear in the opening figures. Can you explain what you mean there, please?
Because when you rolled over into a new trading period, before you did that, you had to clear local suspense, i.e. make good any loss or gain that had been made during that period, or clear it in some other way. And so local suspense should always be zero at the point that you roll over, so there should never be any value for it in the opening figures for the next period.
And you continue, however, I found 14 such lines, all product 6295 gain to LS. What does that mean?
Gain to local suspense.
And what does product 6295 mean?
Every product had a number as well as a name, and the number for gain to local suspense was 6295.
Unfortunately, all created November to December last year, so there is almost no remaining counter evidence. What did you mean by that?
Because these records had been created some 3 months, 2-3 months previously, looking at log files on the counter and so on was unlikely to help.
And how did you find the 14 other examples or instances?
By this point, we're not dealing with riposte and message stores and so on.
No.
We're dealing with an Oracle database system that was all held centrally, something called the branch database. It should really have been the branches database because it contained, there were a lot of different tables containing data for all the branches. Obviously, each record said which branch it referred to and so on. So once I'd found the table of interest, I could just do a query on that table to find all records for that product in that table, regardless of branch.
You're continuing to investigate the cause and implications.
Yes.
Mr. McEwen changes the call priority.
Yes.
Is that increasing its priority?
That's increasing the priority. He was, the team leaders within SSC took it in turns to be sort of duty manager for a day or a week or something. He must have been the duty manager on this occasion, and I probably discussed it with him and said, this looks serious.
You then include, I think that's essentially a hyperlink, I would call it, to BRSS extracts. What are BRSS extracts?
The BRSS was a copy of the branch database, which in fact was what we ran our support jobs on, so we weren't impacting the live database.
And you were doing that presumably, so you've got a document to work from, easily obtainable. The reason that you created the hyperlink.
Yes, this was evidence that I'd added. It was probably an Excel spreadsheet.
You say we only keep opening figures for 3 old trading periods, so you can't be sure when the problem started. Does that mean that the opening figures for 3 4-week periods were that which was retained?
Yes, I believe so, because old data was continually having to be deleted out of the tables.
Continuing later that day, if we scroll down, please. You ask Ibrahim at the NBSC if the suspense report from the 2nd of January is available. He'll obtain it and email it to HSD. IMT, is that the incident management team?
Yes, I believe so.
And what did you want that for?
I thought it would be interesting to see what entries were on the suspense report. This was a report that would have been produced at the branch on the 2nd of January.
You got that by 4:51. You looked
Yes.
at it and it didn't show an anomaly, is that right?
I couldn't see anything on it, yeah.
Scroll down, please. You say you have asked at the top of the page what the branch did about the problem last year. Who were you asking there?
I can't remember whether I asked Ibrahim or whether by this time I was talking direct to the branch. I think it's more likely I asked Ibrahim.
By 4:20, you say you found the cause of the problem.
Yes.
Some data from autumn 2010 has been retained in a table for 14 separate branches. These branches all have been affected by this problem late 2011 and late 2020, though in some cases the amounts involved are small. Do you then set out the 14 affected branches?
Yes, I do.
You wanted, however, to see what needed still to be ascertained, and you, I think, then set out a series of questions and answers for yourself.
Yes, I mean, any investigation, you've got various things that then need to be done, and this was trying to record what needed to be done.
Do we see those at the foot of the page and continuing?
Yes.
So under still to be investigated?
Yes, as far as I can see.
Thank you. 1, exactly how did these records cause the observed effect? 2, why were the records not removed by the normal archiving process? 3, what impact has the problem had on the branch accounts? 4, what impact has the problem had on PulseApp? 5, how do we remove the records to prevent future problems? 6, were there any affected branches which have since closed? 7, there are 19 other branches which have had old data in the affected table but not relating to suspense. Could this cause any problem with the branch accounts? What did you mean by that last entry, please?
When I looked in the table that I had identified that had these 14 local suspense lines in, I found that there was other old data. I've presumably at this point just looked for any records older than a number of months because they should have been removed by the archiving process. I found that there was some other data in there, but as I say, not relating to local suspense. So obviously that was something else that needed to be followed up.
The next day, I think you repeat your questions and then give some of the answers to them. Is that right?
Yes.
So we're now on the 28th. Exactly how did these records cause the observed effect? And then you describe essentially the problem that I outlined at the beginning. Yes?
Yes.
how to identify the problem from branch reports. Branch trading statement, the sum of two discrepancy transferred lines does not match the total of the two discrepancy resolved lines.
Yes.
Can you explain how that identifies the problem from branch reports?
Well, the branch trading statements, which was the cash account replacement, that would show the discrepancies being put into local suspense from all the different stock units, and then before they could roll over into the next trading period, when they rolled over the final stock unit, then they had to clear that amount that was in local suspense. This particular problem, the whole problem was because they were having to clear more than they had put into local suspense, so those numbers would not match up on the branch trading statement.
Thank you. And then if we scroll down, please, to 160510 on the 6th of March. Thank you. You record that there was a conference call with the Post Office, Laura Darby, Mark Wardle and others on the 28th of February about this call, and the spreadsheet showing the impact of the problem on the 14 branches was sent to them by Steve Bansell. We're waiting to hear from Mark whether this is sufficient information for them to resolve the consequences on the branches and the PulseApp and PulseApp.
Yeah.
What were the consequences on the branches?
They had to clear a loss or a gain which was not the amount that they should have had to clear.
You say we will then need to get the old data causing the problem removed from the database.
Yes.
And consider whether extra checks should be put in place to trap similar anomalies in the future.
Yes.
Were extra checks put in place to trap similar anomalies in the future?
Yes, they were eventually.
When were they put in place?
I think it may be at the bottom of, it's at the bottom of one of the peaks. It wasn't for several months, I think.
And what was the check put in place?
I believe there were two checks. One was, as I've already outlined, and then there was a second one, which I can't remember without, I'm sure I've written it down somewhere, or it's certainly in one of the peaks. But this was, we knew we had followed up these specific ones, but it was just in case such a situation should ever occur in future. There was no reason to think it would, but if it did, then people would be alerted to it rather than the postmaster having to raise a call.
Can we look, please, at poll 302 8744? Poll 302 8744. Thank you. This is, I think, a linked peak.
Yes, it's a clone of the one that we were looking at previously.
And if we go forwards, I think, to the 13th of March, please. If we keep scrolling, please. You make an entry on this copy of the cloned peak. We need to make sure a copy of the records being removed is kept somewhere in case there are questions to be answered about any of the affected branch accounts. Yes?
Yes.
Firstly, the records being removed. What records were being removed?
These were the records in this table, BRDBR XBTS data, that had been created in 2010, 2011, which should have been removed by the automatic archiving process, but had not been removed.
And you wanted a copy of that which was removed, retained?
It seemed like a good idea.
You say in case there are questions to be answered about any of the affected branch accounts. Was that in recognition that changes to data that were being made like this might lead to disputes between the Post Office and sub-postmasters if there wasn't a clear and defensible audit trail?
I don't think it was specifically that. It was just obviously there had been an error caused at these branches, and it just seemed like we weren't deleting transaction data here. These are, yes, they are financial records, but they shouldn't have been there. But I just felt we shouldn't just get rid of them without making a note.
You say in case there are questions to be answered. Questions to be asked by who?
Anybody?
Including sub-postmasters?
Yes, potentially, yes.
And so there did need to be a clear and defensible audit trail of what had been removed in case the sub-postmaster asked about it?
Yes, I think so.
Were sub-postmasters told about the changes to the data made by Fujitsu?
I can't remember now. I think Post Office dealt with talking to the affected branches. As I say, this was not changing transaction data.
It was changing data that had financial consequences for the sub-postmasters.
In that it was data that shouldn't have been there, and so we were removing it.
And it was causing them to show a discrepancy that was false.
Yes, because these records which should have been removed were still there. So we needed a copy so we could say, look, it was, if necessary, we could say, yes, it was this record for your branch and it caused a false discrepancy of this amount. And we'd already got that information into spreadsheets and so on. I just felt it was something that should be done.
Do you recall whether the Post Office briefed sub-postmasters on the issue that had afflicted their data, the steps taken to make corrections and identifying what had occurred so that any further problems might be more easily spotted by them when the known issue was impacting them?
I can't remember the details. I know we had a couple of conference calls with Post Office, and I know Gareth wrote a note to attempt to describe the problem, and there were discussions between Gareth and Post Office as to what should be done. But at this precise moment, I know we've got documents about this, but I can't remember the details.
I'll try and help you. If we can look, please, at poll 309 8189. And if we start at page 4, please. We can see from the foot of the page, this is an email signed off by you.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
And if we just go up to the bottom of page 3. We can see it's an email sent by you to Andrew Wynne, Helen Love, and the duty manager.
Yes.
Who was Andrew Wynne?
a post office person.
Was it usual for you to communicate directly to the post office in this way?
Not unless there'd been some previous conference call or request. I wasn't sending as it says, as requested, and I believe this was following one of the conference calls where I had tried to explain this incredibly complicated set of events which had led to this problem. And I think everybody felt it would be clearer if I tried to write it down.
Thank you. And if we scroll up, please, we can see Mr. Wynn's reply. Hi, Anne, thanks for this. I've taken a deep breath and tried to confirm the actual impact on branches and prepare our communications to them. Can you have a look at my first draft to see if I've simplified and condensed what happened without losing meaning or any key detail? Appreciate you'll not be able to comment on what the branch or FSC has subsequently done. Some stuff about the Crown branches and then an individual branch. Any thoughts, Andy? And then scroll up, please. And keep going so we can see all of your email. You deal with the spreadsheet for Willen, which I think one of the Crown branches, and Lower Regent Street.
Yeah.
And then you say, I've made a few possible changes to both letters, which hopefully make the cause and scope of the problem clearer.
Yeah.
Try to phone you because Gareth Jenkins mentioned that this problem is still being discussed at a high level as part of the ongoing investigations checks into Horizon. And I'd hate to, I would hate anything I have put here to compromise that. I don't see why it should be, just wanted to flag it. I assume anything going out to the branches will be reviewed in the light of that.
Yes.
And so essentially Mr. Wynn, was asking you to check his communication out to branches, his draft communication out to branches for accuracy, is that right?
For technical accuracy, yes.
Yes. And was that usual practice for the post office to ask Fujitsu for advice on how it should communicate with sub-postmasters about a problem arising in Horizon and impacting on their post office business?
I don't recall it ever happening any other time, and I wouldn't say they're asking me how to communicate. It was just trying to make sure that any technical information in those letters was as accurate as possible, because obviously they'd be trying to make it clear to the postmasters.
In your first witness statement, you'd said that generally when Fujitsu identified a problem and communicated it to the post office, it was for the post office to determine if, how and when the problem should be communicated to sub-postmasters. Is that right?
Yes.
And so is this something of an exception, i.e. you involving or you being involved?
Yes, I think Post Office had made the decision as what they wanted to do and were then looking to work out how to explain it clearly to the postmasters. And it was just the technical description of the problem as it appeared to the postmasters. They presumably just wanted to try and make sure that was accurate. But I'm not sure I should have been doing that, and I was obviously a little concerned that I was doing it, but I was trying to be helpful.
In your the paragraph beginning tried to phone you, you refer to the problem being discussed as a high level.
Yes.
Can you recall what the high level discussion was about?
Presumably that there was a bug in Horizon.
Yes, but why might a discussion at a high level be compromised by what you had written or approved to be written?
I don't know, but I think I was aware that I'm not always very sort of politically sensitive, and I was not wanting to get it wrong.
And so you wouldn't want to tread on toes,
Yeah.
is that right?
Yeah.
And so did you think you might be compromising the position of Fujitsu in some way?
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to caveat the fact that I was doing things, and I didn't want it just going out because I and Andy Wynne had said so.
If we scroll up, please, to see Mr. Wynne's reply. First 3 paragraphs don't really matter to us, but then he says to you, I intend this to go through our solicitors before it gets sent out. Have a good weekend. And so presumably at this stage, the issue was being treated with sufficient seriousness by the Post Office that its communications out to its sub-postmasters were being vetted or approved or at least looked at by their solicitors.
That's what that says.
Yes. Was that usual?
I don't know. As I said, I don't recall ever having been involved at this particular level before.
And so this, from your perspective, is a bit of an outlier, this type of thing that you were now
yes.
engaged in,
Yeah.
i.e. Communications between you and Mr. Wynne at a working level, those higher up the chain discussing at a management level, perhaps responsibility for the bug, and solicitors checking communications to sub-postmasters.
Yes, this was very unusual, and my input was really because it was such a complicated problem to explain that people were still coming back to me to try and understand exactly which combination of rather a lot of different things had caused these branches to be impacted.
Thank you very much. They're the only questions that I ask you about this bug, and they're the end of my questions. Thank you very much, Mrs. Chambers. So I think there are questions from one core participant, the Hodge, Jones and Allen's team.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Chambers, as you know, I think I appear for a number of sub-postmasters, including Mr. Castleton, who sits to my right.
Yes.
Earlier on in your evidence, you were looking at the ARQ data for week 41, which shows a 0 stamp declaration.
Yes.
And you explained that the stamp declaration was one part of what went into the total stamps carried forward into week 42.
Yes.
And in effect, it was the stamps bearing denominations which come in large books. Those sort of stamps that might say 1 pence or they might say 10 pence or whatever.
Yes.
And obviously that's the staple of any post office selling that sort of stamp.
Yeah.
So we can probably agree that a sub-postmaster wouldn't accurately declare that to be 0. You'd never get to the end of your stamps, would you?
No.
We can go to it if you like, but you may be able to take it from me that in week 41, the final balance, which has the breakdown of the 2 parts, shows a figure for both parts.
Yes.
So there isn't a 0.
Yes.
There's stamps and there's the stock stamps, if you like, the other stamps. That 0 declaration that we see before the cash account was finalised, that appears to be an anomaly. Is that fair?
It appears to be an anomaly, yes. But I do have a probable explanation for it, but not one that I can prove.
Well, I suspect that we probably don't need probable explanations. If there's a one that you can prove, then we could hear it. But
I do not now have any evidence that I've seen that means that I can prove it. But if I could explain what the probable one is, because we know that the earlier declaration for £1,183 was included in the accounts.
Yes.
So that zero declaration appears to have had no effect because you would have expected that to have wiped out that other amount. But when you made a stamp declaration or a cash declaration, you could give a specific draw ID. I think we've seen that somewhere. So normally Mr. Castleton used draw 11. Now it is conceivable, but this is what I can't prove, that this zero declaration had a different draw ID, which is why it didn't overwrite the earlier one. But that, to me, seems likely, because otherwise, if it had been the same draw ID, it would have overwritten the earlier one. If I'd got the full message store that was audited, then that's something I could have checked, and I may well have checked it back in 2006, but I can't check it now, I'm afraid.
No. All right. Well, we might come back to the full extract from the message store in a little while. On the 2nd of February of 2004, the second terminal in Marine Drive, Node 2, was the one that failed, yes?
Yes.
And that was at around 14:20. It came back into action around 14:20 on the 2nd of February, having failed, yeah?
Yes.
If we could look at your witness statement, please. If you need the reference, it's WITN 170200. And if we go, please, to page 5. And we go down to paragraph 17, please. You deal with this issue of Node 2 failing, and in paragraph 17, having sort of dealt with it, and if we go over the page, at the end of the paragraph, I'm so sorry, it's actually at the end of paragraph 18, having dealt with it. You say, in my view, it is extremely unlikely, bordering on impossible, that any transactions were lost as a result of the counter replacement. And then you give your explanation of that. There's no indication of any problem with the physical connection, and even if there were, that could only impact CAP 45 and not cause losses in subsequent periods. So you've asked and answered your own question. Could the loss of Node 2 or the failure of Node 2 have lost transactions? Mm-hmm. You ask that question and then you answer it in the negative, yes?
Yes.
Or at least bordering impossible, you say, extremely unlikely.
Yes, and then I carry on discussing it in 19 as well.
You do indeed. And if we go down to paragraph 21, you make a general observation, counter replacement, though it could potentially result in transactions being lost if the broken counter had been operational but disconnected prior to replacement, would not be a cause of losses occurring 2 or 3 weeks later. So you do acknowledge there that the possibility of losing transactions is present when there's a failure of a hard disk or a node.
There's a possibility, yes.
And that's something that you knew was not just a possibility, but sometimes happened. Is that right? I mean,
yes, it did happen, but yeah, it did happen, but only if you had other problems, comms problems, as well as the counter replacement.
Well, there's one example, isn't there, in, I can take you to the document to help us deal with this. It's POL 400994. And this appears to have been a reasonably significant loss of data. We can see there at the top, recovery of overwritten transactions, and we get the code for the branch where this happened.
Yes.
If we go down a little bit and we look under extra detail, we can see a bit of an explanation of what happened.
Yes.
Due to problems with the gateway, which has been replaced twice, and communications, so that it confirms what you were saying, that it's often when there's a communications issue as well, yes?
And in this case, it was communications both between the gateway and the data centre and between the gateway and the other counters. So it was two different sets of communications.
But what we do see, though, is that approximately 900 transactions, this is the second paragraph, done on the gateway between 1300 on the 9th and 1146 on the 12th, were effectively no longer present. Is that fair?
Yes, they were no longer in the branch message store.
Right. And to get the messages back, we'll need to delete the counter message stores and let the version from the correspondence server replicate down.
Yes,
Yeah?
yes,
And it then goes on to say at the end, we will reinsert the transactions which were completed in that time and reset the stock unit. Yes?
we reinserted the messages written on the 7th and the 8th of September. Yes.
So this is an example of messages being lost following hardware failure.
Yes.
All right, well, we can take that down. Is it because of that sort of issue that you thought to yourself when making your statement, well, I see that there was a hardware replacement at Marine Drive, I better sort of cover that off, if you like?
It was knowing that Mr. Castleton had asked questions in this area in court in 2006, which I felt I perhaps hadn't answered as clearly as I should have done at the time, partly because I wasn't expecting to be asked about it. So I felt it was worth trying to spell out in my statement here my view of the situation based on what I could remember from them, and also examining bits of evidence that have been made available to me in the run-up to this appearance.
Am I right in saying there was an overnight process checking across the whole post office estate for hardware failures, bad blocks, as I think it was termed?
I think there was something like that. I can't remember the
Do you
details.
know when that was introduced or why?
No, I don't know. That wasn't
No.
something that SSC were responsible for.
No, all right. There was a sort of an issue, if you like, around recovery after hardware failures and the need to make sure that any transactions that had been affected by hardware failures needed to be checked over, if you like, and made sure that they were present.
Yes, I mean, recovery in the counter sense would really just be any transactions that were on the stack at the point of failure that didn't get settled, written to message store.
If we look at how that's handled in the Horizon User Guide, we can see that in poll 307, 1234. Page 29 is where a longish section begins. Headed Equipment Failure Checklist, dealing with equipment failure. And then we see at the top of the page it says System Failure. That section 12 is reasonably substantial. Do you recognise this?
I had access to the Horizon System User Guide. I cannot remember whether I ever read this particular section.
If we go down to page 40, identifying lost transactions following a system failure. This is the section, still, as you see, headed system failure, so we're still dealing with system failure as the overarching subject.
Yes.
And identifying lost transactions, then if we scroll down, we can see that a very substantial flowchart is presented. Recovery procedures after system failure. And we can see this flowchart. If we keep scrolling down, it does rather go on and on. If we just carry on, you'll see what I mean. And you see how a sub-postmaster was supposed to go about dealing with matters of recovery after a hardware failure. Let's suppose we can take that down. I don't propose to take you to the detail, but let's suppose that for whatever reason, a sub-postmaster was not able to work through that flowchart perfectly. Presumably that may result in lost or missing transactions.
Without spending a lot of time going through that flowchart, which I'm sorry, but I haven't ever examined in any detail, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that. Basically, if there was a set of transactions on the stack and the counter fails at that point without settling them, then they will be thrown away, but there are certain extra things that needed to be done, particularly for if there were any bill payments in that set of transactions.
Which might pick it up in reconciliation, is that right?
That might be picked up in reconciliation. Without seeing a particular example, it's hard to know. Banking transactions would have been picked up if necessary through reconciliation, and there was something at the end there about if what was on the stack was a rem in or rem out, that might have an effect. But I have to say I don't see the relevance of that to the failure overnight on a Saturday night at Marine Drive.
Well, that was directing sub-postmasters to a process that they were supposed to complete if there had been a system failure, a hardware failure. So presumably that was what any sub-postmaster presented with a hardware failure was supposed to go through.
But wasn't the first question, were you serving at the time?
What relevance would that have?
Because if you weren't using the counter at the point that it failed, then if you'd logged out successfully and the counter was not in use, then there aren't going to be any transactions on the stack that haven't been settled because you can't log out without settling the stack first.
Right. So it would only be affected, would it, if there were settlements currently going on?
Yes, if a postmaster was serving, middle of the day, power cut,
right,
everything dies, in that case, or for some reason the screen freezes, you can't get any further, that situation where you are serving, then you need to consider whether recovery is going to be necessary when you're able to log back on either to that same counter or to a replacement one. But if it fails in the middle of the night after you've finished your trading, you're not using it, there can't be any incomplete transactions, recovery is not an issue.
Can I just ask a question of Mr. Castleton?
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Where there's a screen freeze or a failure mid-transaction, then that's something that the sub-postmaster would need to go through, yes. If that didn't work, and this is not necessarily talking about the overnight failure that we're talking about before,
Yeah.
but if that didn't work, there's the potential for the sub-postmaster to fail to be able to get back their incomplete transactions, yes?
Yes, if you've got a screen freeze in the middle of the day while you're serving, then yes, anything that was on the stack but not settled, which should just be transactions for a single customer, then they will not exist.
And so if they had failed to get through that rather lengthy flowchart and not been able to successfully bring the transactions back through doing that, would that be deemed user error?
I'm not sure if anybody would ever seriously have used that flowchart. What would happen when somebody tried to log back, when somebody was able to log back onto the counter again, if there were bill payments, if there had been a bill payment which had been made but not settled, then the postmaster would actually have been prompted to say whether it's the bill had been paid or not, and that would have taken, that should have sorted that out. Possibly banking transactions as well, but I can't properly remember. If there were other things on the stack, for example, a pension had, I mean, the postmasters, I think, were expected to know that, but they might not have done, that if it failed before settlement, they shouldn't have paid out the pension money or whatever. But even if they didn't know that, if they had paid out the money, but it hadn't settled, then at the end of the day, when they checked all their counterfoils against the report, the totals on the reports, that should have been apparent as a difference, and they could then have put it through at a later stage.
But can I just understand this? If for whatever reason the postmaster was struggling with this and there remained a problem, would that be ascribed as user error?
I'm not sure who would be doing that ascribing.
All right, well, let's look at the instance of Mr. Booth, who was the second temporary sub-postmaster at Marine Drive, who came in after Mr. Castleton was suspended. He got in touch with the post office's lawyers to let them know he'd experienced lost transactions when working in the branch as a result of a screen freeze. And ultimately, it was presented in the case of Poll and Castleton as that the system had worked as it should, and that any problem with disappearing transactions was in effect a failure by Mr. Booth.
So I don't think it should have been categorised in that way.
Well, can we just look at a sort of a snippet from a document, which is Poll 308 1826 _02. Oh, sorry, 022 _ 022. And if we go to page 7, please. When the lawyers were dealing with this, and they were back and forth with Fujitsu, specifically Brian Pinder, this message at the top here, so we can scroll up just to sort of contextualize it. On the 2nd of November, this is an email from Mr. Pinder to Mr. Dilley, with various others, the legal team in effect copied in. And it says, Stephen, I'm guessing you might wish to note that. And then it appears that he's quoting from something. Should the system be restarted for any reason, including following a freeze, there will be evidence of this in the audit trail, which we have in fact been examining in this case. Normally, the only system restarts are as part of the overnight, quotes, clear desk function that occurs between 3:30 and 4 each day. Any other restarts can be considered unusual and could be searched for. So if we just pick that apart, I would suggest, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the overnight clear desk function is what we spoke about earlier, that there was an estate-wide check for any problems with disks.
No, that's not
No?
what ClearDesk was. The riposte service on every counter closed down and restarted at some point between 3:30 and 4 o'clock.
Okay, so that was everywhere, was it?
That
And
was
on-
all counters,
All
yes.
right. But apart from that, which happened every single night everywhere,
Yeah,
any other restarts can be considered unusual and could be searched for.
yes.
I mean, it appears from the section in bold that that was being undertaken. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I see what you mean. I'm just looking at dates. Yes, I have no recollection of specifically looking for those things, but
Right, so,
it could have happened. It may have happened. I can't remember.
so you just don't know if that was you that was
I-
trying to carry out that check for unusual restarts?
Yeah, I don't remember. I could have done it. You wouldn't see it so easily in the ARQ data, but you would see it in the full message extract.
Given what you've said to Mr. Beer earlier about working documents and so forth, there's now no way really of knowing if there were any unusual reboots, is there?
The only other way you could do, and I did try looking a little bit the other day, would be to see if you've got log-ons with no matching log-offs happening. Would be an indication that the counter was restarted, but that's the only thing you could check for in what we have left to us now.
And we do know that that applied in the case of the overnight problem in early February, don't we?
No, that was a different case where there was no log off when there was a log on of the same user on a different counter. That was a different thing. That wasn't a failure to log off. Right. In that case, the log off was done successfully the night before the counter failed, and then when we were looking at transactions on the 2nd of February, we could see that Mr. Castleton logged on and was serving on counter 1, and then the same user logged on to counter 2 without logging off counter 1. But in that case, it doesn't appear that counter 1 became unusable at that point. He just chose to move from one system to the other.
Well, just standing back and taking the view overall, if we may, whatever examination there was for unusual restarts in Marine Drive, we now don't really have any conclusive evidence of it. Is that right?
I haven't been able to find any evidence that it was happening, but it is a possibility that there were some, and no, we don't have anything that would be conclusive.
All right. And what that could have shown is whether there were problems with screen freezes and therefore potentially missing data following screen freezes. Or it would have been easier to find the possibility if you'd found unusual restarts. Is that right?
Yes, but as I said, it wouldn't necessarily cause missing data, but it might.
But it might do.
Potentially, there might have been sessions that didn't settle, but that would not necessarily cause discrepancies.
No, but it might do.
Unlikely to, but yeah, it would
All right.
depend on the individual circumstances.
All right. Going to the questions that you were asked by Mr. Castleton in the trial in 2006, we can have a look at those at LCAS 301300. And if we go to page 271 and down to the bottom of that page. If we just scroll down, the questions had already started, but the bit that I was going to focus on is this. Question, but it does not show the reconnection before disconnection again, does it? Your answer, whether it was because the engineer was briefly plugging things in and then unplugging them again, if we scroll down a little. Question, it does actually occur in other areas. Answer, I really cannot explain that, not from this information. If I looked at it in conjunction with other things, that's you then being a little taken by surprise, is it?
Yes.
And so you're effectively saying there, I'm not sure. The engineer may have been doing X, Y, and Z, but I can't be sure based on what I've got in front of me.
Yes.
There is a little similarity here with some of the other evidence you've given, even just the evidence you've given just now, which is to say, I can't be sure, based on all the material that I have in front of me now, there's potentially other material, but also you tend to offer an explanation, such as the explanation about the engineer unplugging things, or the explanations that you've offered today about the transactions being ones which might have been picked up in reconciliations and so forth. Your explanations that you, or your hypotheses that you put forward, tend to explain it in terms of supporting the system, in terms of making sure that whatever problems there may have been, they probably weren't because of X, Y, and Z. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment, but it's based around 20 years, well, 15 years knowledge of how the system worked and a general feeling. But yes, I'd like to explain things. And normal, you know, in the past, I would have been able to then back that up by looking at stuff that would support it. And yes, I cannot do that anymore because we haven't got the evidence.
All right. Well, the fact is, when branches had hardware failure, which lost data, people in SSE could insert it, couldn't they?
As a last resort, yes, that would be done in order for the branch to balance correctly, including transactions which they had carried out but had failed to get to the places where they should have been.
And the claim, as you put it in your witness statement, and we don't necessarily need to go there, is that when that happened, the SSC were intending to put the branch accounts into the, or rather intending to put the system into the state it would have been in the first place if it hadn't had the failure.
Yes.
What if the system problem was imperfectly understood or imperfectly corrected? Sometimes the sub-postmaster had no idea what was going on, did they?
I can certainly think of one occasion when that is true, yes.
So
But Yeah.
In the circumstances where, and let's face it, people in SSC are human beings and they don't necessarily get it right, in the circumstances where someone in SSC has got it wrong and the SPM has, the sub-postmaster has no idea of what has been happening, there would be no way of identifying where the problems began or ended, would there?
Do you mean no way of the postmaster identifying that, or for anybody else identifying?
Well, certainly for the sub-postmaster, and I think you would have to agree with that. Is that right?
I think I would agree with that, yes.
And the only way that anybody would be able to get to the bottom of it at the other end is if they had the raw data and if the person in SSC had left the right sort of notes behind for people to know what they'd done. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. I would say that these changes were extremely unusual. It was certainly not something that was being done with any regularity at all, but probably a few times a year over all 18,000 branches, it was necessary to do.
Well, is it
was felt
because
necessary to do some sort of correction?
is it because of the rarity of it that you do not effectively countenance the possibility that the pension transactions that you were looking at with Mr. Beer were inserted by SSC in an attempt to rectify data that may have been lost?
I totally discount that explanation because you can see that they took place on counter one. You can see the session ID number. You can see that Mr. Castleton or whoever was using LCA 001 was serving on counter one. He did a whole set of pension transactions in one session, possibly catching up for things that had been paid out manually during the morning because they'd been reduced to working on a single counter. That session was then suspended. Node 2 came back up. Mr. Castleton logged onto Node 2, which transferred this suspended session across from counter one, and then you can see that that session was eventually unsuspended and was settled on counter two, and that is quite clear from the transaction numbers and the session numbers, and anybody inserting those afterwards would not have been able to use those numbers because they were the sequence numbers were being used by the person on the counter, logged in on the counter at that time.
All right. Disclosure, one short topic before I have a final topic after that. So on disclosure, this won't take long. Was the extract from the message store that you produced to do your report on week 42, was that the full message store for the Marine Drive branch?
It was the full set of messages in that particular week.
Oh, just for that week?
It was
all
that,
right.
just for that week. Was
So it
what,
wasn't for the whole period, it was just week 42?
That was what I looked at when producing the week 42 cash account, or when attempting to. But subsequently, I'm just about certain that we did have all the messages for January and February, which I did then look through. But I have not got any
Proof of
seen
that?
anything to prove that.
No.
But I know I spent a lot of time sitting there and looking at the data over that whole period.
The extract that we know did happen, because otherwise you couldn't have written that report, the week 42 extract, just thinking about the disclosure explanation that you had from Mr. Dilley at the end of the case that you quoted in your afterthoughts, really that should have been disclosed, shouldn't it?
Yes.
And was that ever passed to Mr. Dilley with the report, do you know?
I don't know because I was not responsible for disclosure. There was something in that comment that I quoted from Mr. Dilley saying that he had had sight of the message store, and I can't remember if it's in there or another document from Mr. Dilley saying that he'd offered Mr. Castleton sight of the message store, but
Yes, certainly he'd offered him sight
yeah,
of the message
but because
store.
it was so big
Big.
and difficult, and I don't know if that was just week 42 or if that was for the entire period.
But you can't be sure whether you gave the extract of week 42 to Mr. Dilley, you just don't know.
Me personally,
No.
no, I didn't.
No, you didn't, I see.
Can I ask you, were you ever asked a direct question by Mr. Dilley, if anybody, I imagine, but let's say by anyone, during the course of your investigations, Mrs. Chambers, have you created any documents which you consider might be relevant to the issues we are considering in this trial?
I don't recall anybody ever asking me that question, no.
All right, thank you.
Then just your explanation about Kells and being told not to mention Kells and indeed to positively refer to other documents rather than Kells. Again, that's something which, looking back, it would have met that disclosure obligation that Mr. Dilley set out for you and you set out in your afterthoughts, wouldn't it?
Yes.
All right. Now, why did you accept that you shouldn't refer to Kells?
I assumed that that's what they said, and so that's what I did.
why
Perhaps I
didn't-
should have questioned it, but I was in a very unfamiliar situation for me. And
Why didn't you mention it in your afterthoughts document? Because at that stage, obviously, you had been told by Mr. Dilley what you'd been told about your disclosure obligations, and as we've just agreed, Kells would have been disclosable under that test. So why not mention the problem with you being told that you shouldn't refer to Kells in your afterthoughts?
I thought I did. Did I mention peaks in there?
You certainly talked about including things like the event logs on the back of peaks and making sure that people had peaks, but not Kells.
Yes. That was an oversight on my part when I wrote the afterthoughts document then. I mean, I perhaps thought peaks, it wasn't just the Kells that weren't being disclosed, it was peaks, which I think to me I thought was important as well. But yes, maybe Kells equally so, but I didn't include it in that document. So, but for no reason.
Did it not strike you even then as perhaps slightly suspicious that nobody wanted you to mention known error logs with that title being what it was?
I don't think I thought of it as suspicious. I thought it seemed strange, but as I said, I was in a very unfamiliar situation.
All right, well, finally, a few questions on what I think will be just a short final topic. Did you believe that Horizon was fundamentally robust in 2004
Fundamentally, yes.
and still in 2006?
Yes.
Confirmation bias happens when we filter all the evidence we receive to only take account of those parts which support what we already believe to be true. Are you familiar with that concept?
I'm familiar with the concept, yes.
When you gave evidence in 2006, do you think you were affected by confirmation bias, your belief in the fundamental robustness of Horizon?
No, because I knew that I had looked in great detail at the available evidence, and I was looking for any sign of a system problem, and the numbers added up. It wasn't that the discrepancies were being calculated wrongly.
But you believed the system to be fundamentally robust,
No,
didn't you?
not necessarily. No, I mean, if there'd been any sign that the numbers were not adding up, then I would have been onto it and I would have said so. But the discrepancies were calculated correctly based on the transactions that had been recorded. There were no obviously incorrect transactions in the system, in what I could see of the system. All I could conclude was that what was on the system was not an accurate reflection of what had taken place at the branch. And there was nothing that indicated that the system had malfunctioned in any way that would give rise to transactions either not being on the system or being there but there incorrectly. But fundamentally, finally that could only be ascertained by comparing what was on the system with what had actually taken place at the branch. And once the day, the week has passed, that becomes almost impossible to verify.
Are you still, at some level, trying to cover off or explain away those anomalies or issues which we can see?
No, where there have been anomalies, for example, the missing 92 pence in the ARQ data, I've found that. I've investigated it, I've checked what the consequences of that are, and I have reported it. Whether that report didn't get through to Mr. Castleton and his team, I don't know, because I was not reporting direct to him, but I had no intention of covering that up.
Do you now believe that the case against Mr. Castleton resulted in a miscarriage of justice?
I think Mr. Castleton should have been given much more help in trying to work out why the money in his branch did not match what was on the system. And I really wish I could find a problem. I mean, I've still been looking to see if there's just anything that looks as if it could be something wrong with the system that might have caused it, but I found nothing in 2004. And okay, you can say I didn't look hard enough then. I did what I didn't know that
No, you
this
didn't know
would
then
still
what-
be being talked about.
No.
I did a reasonable job in 2004, which I then gave evidence on. I rechecked, looking for errors, not looking for explanations of why there weren't errors in 2006. I continued to wonder if there was something I had missed. If it was, what could it be? I've never found any error in Horizon, Legacy Horizon, that could have caused Mr. Castleton's losses. And so, yes,
So
I
you now do you say that if there was an error in Horizon, it's one that you simply didn't find?
it's one that left no evidence and that nobody has ever found if there was such an error, if there could even be such an error.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Page. Is that it, Mr. Beer?
Yes, it is, unless you have any questions.
No, thank you. It's obvious that you have provided two very detailed witness statements, Mrs. Chambers, and you've given evidence before me over very many hours. For all those things, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We reconvene at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Thank you.